I noticed the first mistake at 2:17, when my coffee cup trembled, even though the rig was still, and I realized the vibration wasn't coming from the machinery beneath my boots. It was rising up through the water, slow and uneven, like something testing its weight against the steel legs. I remember laughing quietly, because exhaustion makes you stupid, and thinking about how the night shift always messes with your head. That was before I remembered there are 11 strange rules written nowhere official, only passed between mechanics like confessions, rules you follow if you want to leave the rig the same way you arrived. I had already broken one, and the water hadn't finished reacting yet. I remember the first time I really understood Rule 1. If you hear anything that sounds deliberate coming from the water after midnight, you do not acknowledge it. It was my second week on the rig, and I had stayed behind to finish checking a malfunctioning pressure gauge while the others had gone to their bunks. The wind had dropped, leaving only the low hum of the machinery and the faint, uneven lapping of water against the legs of the platform. I thought I heard a voice at first, soft, questioning, almost like it was asking if anyone was awake, but I told myself it was just the pipe settling. At first, ignoring it seemed natural, because we had been trained to treat the ocean as unpredictable but impersonal. Still, there was a hesitation, a twitch in my shoulder muscles, as if my body knew something wasn't right before my mind did. I went back to the gauge, trying to concentrate on the readings, but the sound returned, slower this time, deliberate in its timing. My eyes flicked toward the edge of the platform, where the water should have been empty blackness, yet it seemed denser, moving with purpose, like a shadow that understood I was watching. I thought about calling out, thinking a joke might ease the tension, but my throat went dry. The rules we didn't get in safety manuals had always seemed like superstition, until that moment. You don't respond, you don't look for it, you don't even flinch, because acknowledgement is invitation. I realized the weight of that lesson as a shiver ran up my spine, and I kept my hands steady on the gauge, even though the rhythm of the water now seemed synchronized with my heartbeat. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. I couldn't tell. Time lost meaning when you stayed on the edge of perception, knowing that anything deliberate in the water wanted recognition. I learned quickly that even a twitch of your finger toward the railing, a glance too long, could change the way it moved. Every instinct screamed to call someone, to tell Harris or one of the others, but Rule 1 was drilled into me that first night: the ocean doesn't forget who listens. Sleep became a dangerous idea. I tried lying down, letting exhaustion creep in, but the moment I closed my eyes, the sound was back, slower, almost patient. It wasn't music, or the usual swell, but the sort of sound you felt rather than heard, pressing against your ribs, pressing against your mind. I counted breaths, and it counted with me. I realized then that the rule wasn't just about avoiding acknowledgement, it was about not letting the water know you noticed it at all. The next day, Harris didn't say much. He just watched me for a long moment before muttering something I didn't catch, his eyes flicking toward the railing, as if the night itself had moved with him. I didn't ask. I couldn't. Asking would be like admitting that I had failed. And I had. Every step on the platform after that carried a new weight, because I knew the water remembered. I felt its memory against my boots, against the steel legs, pressing upward like a secret. Even routine tasks became tests of nerve. Tightening a bolt, or checking the pressure line now demanded that I move methodically, without glancing at the water, without letting the sound of its deliberate movements seep into my awareness. One night, I swear I felt it pause when I paused, its rhythm mirroring mine. I thought I was imagining it, but Harris later hinted he'd felt the same, that the ocean had attention, like it was deciding who would leave the rig hole and who would not. I started keeping notes, writing observations in the small ledger tucked under the console. I cataloged the movements, the pauses, the odd hums, even though I never wrote what they felt like directly, because that would be acknowledgement. Patterns emerged slowly, but nothing predictable. Some nights, the water stayed still for hours. Other nights, it tested me relentlessly, deliberate and patient. I learned to breathe differently, to pace differently, to exist without letting my mind register the details fully, because registering was the same as responding. By the third week, I was always aware. Every step to the galley, every check on the gauges, every glance toward the horizon came with the same silent question: had I acknowledged it? Even the thought of the sound counting me was enough to send a tremor through my hands. I tried telling myself it was paranoia, but no logic worked out there. Harris said once, quietly, that you don't realize the water knows until it decides to prove it. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask, because the first night had already taught me the importance of silence. Sometimes, I think the worst part wasn't the waiting, the tension, or the feeling of being observed. It was the realization that Rule 1, if you hear anything that sounds deliberate coming from the water after midnight, you do not acknowledge it, wasn't about survival in the traditional sense. It was about staying sane, about maintaining the illusion that you were still in control, even while the ocean slowly shifted the ground beneath your certainty. I had no illusions left. Every night, I walked along the railing with the quiet understanding that acknowledgement could be my last conscious act. I couldn't stop thinking about it during the day, either. Shadows on the deck, reflections on the metal, even the swell of water during routine inspections made me flinch. The rule became part of my rhythm, part of my attention, a silent metronome dictating my movements. And I realized something else, more disturbing. The water didn't just respond to acknowledgement. It remembered your mistakes, kept them in the dark folds of its body, waiting for the moment you slipped, the moment you considered breaking Rule 1 even in thought. I realized Rule 2, never leave a tool or piece of equipment unattended on the deck, no matter how small or insignificant it seems. The first time I dropped a wrench while checking the outer railings, it bounced once on the steel surface and landed near the edge, almost slipping into the dark water. I froze, my stomach knotting, because even a small object left behind felt like an invitation to something watching. Harris had told me before that the ocean remembers your carelessness, but I hadn't understood until that moment how literal he was. The water seemed to pulse around the dropped wrench, small ripples that didn't belong to the wind or tides, as if it was evaluating me. I leaned closer to retrieve it, gripping the railing, and felt the subtle movement beneath my feet. The rig wasn't shaking, at least not mechanically, but there was a vibration, almost like a warning pulse. My fingers closed around the handle, and I swore the shadows near the edge of the platform shifted slightly. For the first time, I understood why Rule 2 existed beyond simple safety. It was about signaling. Objects left behind were noticed, cataloged by whatever intelligence lingered just beyond sight, and consequences could come later, delayed and patient. After that, I became hyper-aware of every tool I touched. Even bolts, clamps, or tiny pressure gauges were accounted for, inspected, returned, or secured. The rig itself became a map of responsibility, each step measured against the possibility that leaving something behind was equivalent to leaving an opening in your defenses. I caught myself rearranging items obsessively, counting them in my mind, marking their positions, because mistakes didn't just result in accidents, they were noticed. I couldn't see what noticed them, but I felt the shift in the air every time I erred. Harris never explicitly explained what happened if you left something behind. There were stories whispered at the galley, of objects disappearing, of tools being found smashed, or worse, never recovered. One mechanic reportedly swore he saw a wrench float above the water for a moment, hovering as if defying physics, before sinking. The words sounded insane at first, but after nights of tension and careful observation, I started to understand. Rule 2 wasn't just about preventing mistakes. It was about avoiding acknowledgement of carelessness that would stick in the water's memory. Even routine maintenance became a careful choreography. I had to check pipes, lubricate moving joints, inspect pressure lines, and do it all while keeping track of every nut and bolt. The simplest task could spiral into terror if something fell unnoticed. Once a small gauge I meant to set aside slipped from my hand. My reflexes kicked in, snatching it up just before it hit the deck, but my chest heaved with panic. I imagined the water noting that hesitation, storing it, waiting for me to let my guard down again. The rule was especially brutal during storms. I remember one night, wind lashing the rig and waves hammering the legs. When a small toolbox slid from the maintenance shelf, I lunged after it, my heart in my throat, barely catching it before it hit the wet steel floor. Harris was standing behind me, watching without speaking, as if assessing my reaction. The storm should have been the danger, but the real danger was the implication of a single lapse. Leaving a tool unattended could be a mistake without immediate consequence, but the water would remember, patient and deliberate, until it demanded attention. I started imagining consequences constantly. Every hammer left on a bench, every wrench dropped, every bolt forgotten became a seed in some unseen ledger beneath the rig. I couldn't convince myself it was superstition. The incidents were too consistent, too precise. Objects didn't vanish randomly, and accidents didn't just happen. There was a pattern, a logic, cruel and patient, that made me track everything I touched. Even when exhausted, I double-checked, triple-checked, because Rule 2 had taught me that the smallest negligence could become monumental in ways I didn't yet understand. By the third week of offshore rotation, I had a routine ingrained. I counted my tools at the start and end of every shift, inspected the decks, and never left anything in sight that could roll or slip. Even personal items weren't immune. A dropped pen or forgotten notebook felt dangerous. I imagined the water collecting these tiny offenses, storing them like dark keepsakes, and I began to dread the moment it might decide to return them. Harris once said quietly that the ocean is patient, but it doesn't forget, and now I understood what he meant. The psychological toll was subtle but constant. My sleep was shallow, punctuated by dreams of falling objects and steel plates tilting toward the water. I woke in cold sweats, checking my surroundings, counting tools, imagining the smallest items drifting toward the edge and vanishing. I realized the rule extended beyond practical safety. It was about conditioning, training you to exist without ever letting a careless act escape your attention. It shaped behavior in a way that mechanical checklists could never capture. I can't count the nights I spent crouched on the deck, inventorying every object in sight, running hands along edges, making sure nothing could possibly be left behind. I became obsessive, but the obsession was necessary. Rule 2 was less about immediate danger and more about survival under the pressure of invisible oversight. One slip, one tiny lapse could ripple through the hours ahead, and you'd only know it too late. The water had memory, patience, and precision, and the rule was the only buffer between those qualities and the crew's unprepared minds. Even now I feel the echo of that lesson. Every tool I touch offshore carries weight beyond its mass. The stakes are quiet but absolute. The moment you leave something behind, the moment your attention falters, the water doesn't forgive, and the rig becomes a testing ground. I've never seen a direct consequence, not yet, but I know it's coming for anyone careless enough to forget. And after weeks of practice, even I can't shake the sense that the water is always counting, always cataloging, ready to act. I first understood Rule 3. Always report an unusual sighting immediately. No matter how trivial it seems, even if it contradicts what others are experiencing during a midnight inspection of the outer deck. I had glimpsed something movement in the water, subtle but too deliberate to be a wave. I froze, thinking about whether to mention it to anyone or brush it off, but instinct screamed that hesitation could make it worse. The rig felt impossibly quiet, the lights above me throwing long shadows across steel beams, and I remembered Harris's warning. Silence can turn observation into a liability. I called out into the headset, a trembling voice trying to keep casual. Unusual movement near leg 6, approaching from the north. The reply was static, delayed, uncertain. It wasn't denial, it was hesitation. I realized immediately that even reporting the sighting wrong could change outcomes. The water below me rippled, almost mockingly, as if it was measuring the sincerity of my acknowledgement. I felt an uneasy weight in my chest, knowing that not only was observation dangerous, but misreporting could be catastrophic in ways I could not yet comprehend. The rule wasn't just about accuracy, it was about timing. One delay in communication, One hesitation between noticing and reporting could allow something to advance unnoticed. During my rotation, I had witnessed what happened when another crew member ignored a flicker in the darkness, claiming it was just a reflection. By the time the night shift arrived to investigate, the object of concern was gone, and the rig had been subtly rearranged, tools missing, small maintenance items displaced, and yet no one could explain how it happened. I understood then that the water measured trust and attention in ways we couldn't see. Once reported, the response was never immediate. Harris told me quietly that the ocean, or whatever monitored it, was patient. It allowed acknowledgement, but tested commitment. I had reported movement twice that night, each time describing its position, size, and trajectory, only to feel the same pulse beneath my boots, a silent reassurance that recognition alone wasn't enough. Observation had to be followed by action, and action had to be precise, consistent, and timely. Otherwise, the rig became a labyrinth of small, uncorrected errors, each one amplified in the darkness. Routine inspections became mentally exhausting. Every shadow, reflection, and ripple had to be considered potentially deliberate. I began to carry a mental log of everything unusual I saw, sometimes reporting trivialities simply because the rule demanded it. Once a slight discoloration in one of the support legs prompted me to radio in an inspection request. The other side of the line laughed softly, dismissing it, but I persisted. The water didn't laugh, didn't dismiss. Its attention was constant, and Rule 3 had taught me that trivialities might carry the weight of life or death in ways we couldn't immediately recognize. There were nights I questioned my own senses, seeing things that could not exist, ripples that moved against the current, shadows that lingered too long, reflective glints that seemed to follow me. The psychological strain was relentless. Reporting became a ritual, a lifeline. And yet the more I reported, the more I noticed subtle patterns. Missed reports seemed to leave residual effects, small shifts in the environment, an almost imperceptible rearrangement of objects. The rig itself felt alive, responding to compliance and negligence alike. Harris never explained the full consequences of failing to report, only shared anecdotes, cryptic and vague. A hammer left half on the deck, a tool dropped unseen, a shadow ignored, all resulted in untraceable disturbances. He emphasized only that the rule existed for a reason, to prevent the accumulation of oversight. The unusual sightings we were trained to report were often minor, nothing that would endanger the platform mechanically, but the effect of failing to report them always rippled outward. Each ignored sighting was a seed for later, unseen complications. By my 4th week, the rule had become an instinct. Even the faintest anomaly triggered an immediate mental checklist. Notice, describe, report. I realized that hesitation was dangerous, not just because the water remembered, but because it demanded evidence of compliance in real time. The rig was a test, a system of observation, where reporting was less about the message and more about demonstrating attentiveness. Each time I delayed, I felt the invisible presence assessing me, as if timing itself mattered as much as the report. The strangest part was how other crew members reacted differently to the same rule. Some were dismissive, confident in their ability to ignore subtle anomalies. Others were hyper-vigilant like me, measuring every shadow, every ripple, afraid of the consequences of even minor omissions. I found myself watching their actions as carefully as I watched the water, because inconsistency among us seemed to provoke subtle but unsettling changes in the rig's environment. Rule 3 had an unspoken secondary purpose. It forced accountability, not just for observation, but for shared vigilance across the team. Even after the initial sightings, I couldn't stop analyzing details. A flashlight beam caught glints on the water's surface that weren't reflections, a knot in the rope that seemed too deliberate, an irregular pattern in the wake of supply boats passing nearby. Each instance demanded immediate reporting, whether or not anyone believed me. Over time, I noticed that delayed reports corresponded to environmental disturbances that were difficult to explain. Doors ajar, tools displaced, equipment slightly misaligned. Reporting became a method of survival, a safeguard against consequences that might not reveal themselves immediately. Sleep offered no relief. Dreams were populated with fragments of sightings I had reported, intertwined with ones I hadn't. Even in dreams, hesitation felt like failure. Waking moments were dominated by the same obsession, noticing and documenting, staying ahead of the water's attention. I understood that the ocean, or the force observing it, didn't operate on conventional timelines. Immediate action mattered because delay could amplify repercussions, turning trivial sightings into significant hazards. Compliance was survival. Hesitation was invitation. As the nights continued, I realized that reporting unusual sightings was less about confirming the event and more about acknowledging responsibility. The rule demanded transparency, with the unseen observer, a proof of attentiveness. I learned to verbalize even fleeting impressions, to describe movements, colors and angles, not for anyone else but to demonstrate recognition. Failing to report even a minor anomaly felt like an omission that could linger, like leaving a mark on the rig that would be noticed later when it was too late to correct. By the 5th week, I was exhausted but methodical. The rig became a landscape of vigilance, where every movement, every shadow, every ripple had significance. Reporting was no longer optional, it was instinct, a shield against unseen scrutiny. I had witnessed subtle effects of delayed acknowledgement, and I knew that ignoring Rule 3 in the slightest detail could set off chains of consequences we were only beginning to sense. Observation, report, and timing were survival tools, embedded in my behavior down to the smallest twitch of my muscles. I first understood Rule 4. Never turn your back on the water when the lights dim, even for a second during one of the routine late-night inspections. The rig's emergency lights flickered briefly, plunging the deck into uneasy shadows, and I instinctively looked away for a moment to adjust my jacket. That hesitation was enough. The water seemed to respond immediately, waves clustering unnaturally near the platform's edge, shadows elongating across the steel. I realized then that the rule wasn't just precautionary, it was about maintaining constant awareness, because the water, and whatever watched it, noticed every lapse. Even minor distractions became dangerous. A dropped tool, a moment of conversation with a colleague, or a reflexive glance at a monitor could pull my attention long enough for the water to shift subtly, unnervingly in response. I began timing my movements meticulously, adjusting my routine so I could always face the dark expanse beyond the rig. The instinct to look away had to be trained out completely, because even the briefest lapse felt like an opening. Shadows in the corner of my vision no longer seemed accidental. They felt intentional, measured, and patient. I remember the night shift after a storm, when the lights dimmed for nearly 10 minutes during a power fluctuation. The water was restless, more so than usual, rising higher against the rig's legs with a slow, deliberate rhythm. I was alone on the outer deck, frozen mid-step, aware that any momentary distraction could be catastrophic. My mind raced with everything I had learned about vigilance. The rule had a psychological weight. It forced an unbroken line of sight, a continuous acknowledgement that I was aware of my environment, because the water punished even the smallest lapses in attention. It was not about fear of falling or slipping, at least not entirely. I realized that the real threat was unseen, a presence that responded to neglect. On nights when the lights dimmed, even normal waves seemed deliberate, stretching and curling in unnatural ways. I would stand motionless, calculating the timing of each shift of my gaze, each footstep, each adjustment of clothing or equipment. Turning my back, even for a split second, was like leaving a door open for something waiting just beyond sight. I began to move through my tasks with a mechanical precision born of instinct and dread. Other crew members treated the rule differently. Some joked about it, claiming that paying attention to every ripple was paranoia. Others, like me, walked the outer deck with taut muscles and unblinking eyes, aware that even a glance away could invite consequences. I saw it in their shadows, subtle flinches, hesitations, moments when the dim light made them pause. The water's behavior seemed to intensify around those moments, as if it could sense the difference between someone vigilant and someone distracted. The rule, I realized, measured more than observation. It measured commitment and presence. During one inspection, I saw a shadow in the water that shouldn't have existed. It moved in opposition to the waves, deliberate and focused, almost as if it were tracking my movements. I froze, heart pounding, remembering Rule 4. I didn't turn away. I didn't even blink. For the first time, I understood the subtle calculus of survival. The water didn't care that I saw it, only that I remained aware, maintaining constant acknowledgement of its presence. That single discipline, following the rule without deviation, felt like a fragile lifeline. The rule's psychological weight grew heavier with each passing night. I started sleeping in short intervals, waking repeatedly to check lights and shadows. Even during the day, when the water seemed calm, I found myself imagining moments when the lights could fail, rehearsing how I would respond. The discipline became reflexive. Every time the lights flickered, my gaze immediately returned to the water. A second's distraction could unravel hours of careful vigilance. I realized then that survival offshore wasn't just about machinery or storms. It was about controlling attention, maintaining unbroken focus, and avoiding even the smallest lapse. I noticed a subtle shift in my perception. When the lights dimmed, everything felt magnified. A distant reflection, the sway of a rope, the uneven glint of metal, all became signals demanding recognition. The water seemed to calibrate its movements based on my awareness, subtly testing my adherence to Rule 4. I began documenting these patterns in my mind, tracking the timing and intensity of shadows, the frequency of dimming, and the way waves responded to my presence. Each night, the rig felt less like a workplace and more like a living test of vigilance. I began anticipating the dimming. Even routine operations were timed around potential light fluctuations. I would pause, adjust, and brace myself as if expecting an immediate threat, though I never saw anything conventional. The rule had trained me to exist in a heightened state of awareness, where even the smallest distraction could feel like a breach of contract with the unseen. Over time, I realized that Rule 4 wasn't just about the water. It was about conditioning me, and by extension the crew, to a state of perpetual presence, where survival depended on unbroken attention to every flicker, every movement, every shadow. Sleep deprivation became part of the regimen. Standing watch during dim periods, my mind oscillated between hypervigilance and exhaustion. I learned to trust instincts over logic, reacting to movements too subtle to register fully. Even when alone, I felt observed, aware that turning away, even to blink, even to adjust clothing was dangerous. Following the rule required constant negotiation between fear and discipline, between instinct and endurance, and I began to understand why so many crew members became tense, jittery, or withdrawn during extended rotations offshore. As the days stretched into weeks, I realized the rule had subtly reshaped my behavior beyond the rig. Every reflective surface, every darkened window, every low-light scenario triggered the same alertness, the same vigilance drilled by Rule 4. I could no longer ignore peripheral movement without unease, and I carried the rule with me in ways I hadn't anticipated. It was no longer just a precautionary measure for the deck. It had become a lens through which I experienced all low-light environments, a reminder that attention alone was a lifeline, and that any lapse could be dangerous in ways that might never be visible. I first learned Rule 5. Never isolate yourself on the rig at night, no matter how safe the area seems. The night I decided to check the upper deck alone, the wind had dropped, leaving the rig eerily quiet, and the usual hum of machinery felt distant, almost absent. I thought it would be easier to work without distractions, just me and the steel beneath my boots. At first it seemed harmless, routine even, but the moment I turned a corner, I sensed a shift, subtle and deliberate, in the air around me. The shadows grew longer, the darkness seemed thicker, and I felt a weight pressing down from the water beyond. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. After all, I had been offshore for weeks and seen nothing that truly defied explanation. but the stillness of the water, the unnatural arrangement of the waves near the rig, and the way the shadows moved in patterns I couldn't identify, made me uneasy. I remembered Harris's warning that isolation was dangerous, not because of storms or falling equipment, but because the rig, or whatever observed it, punished solitude. The rule wasn't about fear of being alone. It was about the vulnerability that solitude created in an environment that was already patient and deliberate. Every creak of the platform seemed amplified. The stairwell behind me groaned, as if testing my resolve, and I could hear the subtle scrape of something moving across the deck, though I didn't see it. I told myself to return to the central control room, but a small part of me lingered, curious, stubborn. That moment of indecision was enough to make me realize why the rule existed. Isolation didn't just make mistakes more dangerous, it amplified the consequences, turning minor lapses into critical errors that could be exploited by forces we could not perceive. I walked faster toward the main hub, feeling eyes, or at least the sense of attention, tracking my movements. Every time I slowed, a shiver of uncertainty ran through me, and I imagined the water adjusting, testing me, gauging how far I would stray before retreating to the safety of others. Rule 5 wasn't merely a guideline, it was a form of protection against unseen observation, a psychological buffer that ensured multiple pairs of eyes remained present. Even if the others weren't aware, their proximity mattered. The rig felt alive in my isolation. Steel beams seemed to stretch unnaturally, railings shimmered with reflections that didn't match the lights, and the shadows cast by overhead lamps elongated as though aware of my position. I realized then that solitude made you hyper-visible in a way that collective presence didn't. The rule demanded that we move as a web of awareness, a network of observation, so that no single person became an easy target for whatever monitored the rig. One lapse alone could ripple through hours of oversight, and I understood that my small rebellion against the rule had already introduced risk. Even routine checks were affected by the rule. Inspecting valves, monitoring gauges, or performing maintenance required that I always account for who was nearby. I couldn't afford to drift too far from other crew members, and I began calculating my steps to ensure proximity without impeding their work. The smallest deviation from this invisible protocol felt reckless. Isolation didn't just make errors more likely, it amplified the unseen consequences, making each minor misstep feel like a prelude to disaster. I recall one night when the fog rolled in thick around the rig, muffling sound and reducing visibility to almost nothing. I stayed near the central platform, watching other crew members as they performed checks. One of them, younger and brash, wandered alone to the edge of the deck, confident in the calm water and my presence across the rig. I wanted to call out, warn him, but the moment I hesitated, a subtle shift in the water's pattern near his position made my stomach twist. It was as though the environment had immediately recognized his isolation and was adjusting accordingly. That was the night I truly internalized the rule. Isolation distorted perception. I noticed small details others might miss: the irregular rise of a wave, the faint ripple against the platform legs, reflections that didn't align with light sources. When I was alone, those details became overwhelming, impossible to ignore, and I could feel my own anxiety amplifying them. The presence I imagined in the water didn't need to act loudly. It was enough that solitude made every movement, every sound, every shadow feel deliberate, purposeful, and inescapable. Rule 5 had taught me that alone, you are never truly safe, and perception becomes both weapon and prison. Psychologically, the rule reshaped behavior beyond night inspections. Even brief moments of isolation, like stepping away to check a small tool or move a piece of equipment, triggered a heightened awareness of surroundings. I walked with eyes scanning constantly, calculating distances, estimating visibility, and gauging the potential of unseen observation. The rig became a grid of proximity, where survival depended on maintaining visual and spatial connections with others, however tenuous. The water's patience seemed to extend only as far as your compliance with this principle. Sleep patterns also suffered. I found myself lingering near others, even in sleeping quarters, unwilling to risk isolation, and waking frequently to check that crew members were accounted for. Nights became exercises in coordination, where deviation could feel like a breach of safety. I noticed the smallest discrepancies: someone missing from their usual patrol, a door slightly ajar, a shadow where none should be, and my mind immediately linked them to the dangers of isolation. The rule wasn't about being physically threatened. It was about avoiding exposure to forces that noticed absence as much as presence. Over weeks I internalized the subtle nuances of the rule. It wasn't enough to simply be near others. I had to remain alert, engaged, and synchronized with the rhythms of the rig. Every movement, even mundane tasks, was measured against the potential consequences of solitude. Rule 5 was less about rules written in a manual and more about instinct, conditioning, and maintaining unbroken awareness, a lesson learned painfully and continuously in the quiet hours of the night, when the rig seemed to breathe around me. By the end of that rotation, I could feel the weight of the rule in my bones. The rig had become a place where awareness was survival, and isolation, however brief, was a dangerous indulgence. Even now, I remain wary in moments of quiet, hyper-conscious of my surroundings, knowing that the ocean, and whatever observes it, remembers who steps away alone. Solitude is a risk, a test, and the rule ensures that no one forgets it, even when exhaustion and habit try to convince you otherwise. I first grasped Rule 6: never ignore a change in the water's color or texture, no matter how subtle it appears during a late-night check of the platform's lower legs. I had noticed the water darken slightly near one of the supports, almost imperceptibly, and for a moment thought it was a trick of the lights or a reflection of the rig itself. But the shift was deliberate, and my gut told me to report it immediately. The moment I hesitated, the water seemed to respond, forming small swirls and patterns that weren't caused by the current or wind. I realized then that the ocean, or whatever monitored it, reacted to observation and inaction alike. Even subtle variations demanded attention. I learned to examine reflections carefully, notice every ripple, and feel the weight of movement beneath the rig's legs. A patch of water slightly darker than the surrounding surface, or a texture that seemed smoother or more jagged than usual, could indicate something deliberate lurking beneath. Ignoring these signs wasn't an option. I remember a night when a faint shimmer on the water's surface caught my eye. I didn't dismiss it, and immediately radioed my observation to the control room. The response was quiet but urgent, and I felt the difference in tension almost physically, like a change in pressure around the platform. Routine maintenance became intertwined with vigilance for these changes. Every inspection included an assessment of the water, a calculation of patterns and anomalies that might signal something unseen. I noticed that even small deviations, tiny color shifts, unusual wavelets, irregular reflections, could have consequences if left unreported. The water seemed alive, aware of who was paying attention and who wasn't. Following Rule 6 wasn't about preventing accidents with the rig. It was about acknowledging presence and perception, maintaining a mental record of subtleties that could later prove crucial. The psychological impact was subtle, but persistent. The more I observed, the more aware I became of tiny differences that others might dismiss. Variations in hue, the texture of ripples, or faint currents that shouldn't exist, became markers of vigilance. Each deviation felt deliberate, as if the water were testing me, measuring my response, and cataloging my attentiveness. Over time, I realized that ignoring these small changes wasn't just carelessness, it was an invitation for consequences that might be delayed, but would inevitably arrive. One night, after a storm had passed, the water near the rig's support legs was unusually smooth, almost glass-like. I had learned to trust my instincts, so I didn't ignore it. The smoothness was subtle, but it carried a weight, a deliberate quality in the way it reflected the platform lights. I documented the anomaly and reported it immediately. Within minutes, a colleague appeared at my side, confirming the same observation. The acknowledgement itself seemed to settle the tension, as if recognition alone had satisfied the unseen observer. That moment solidified the importance of Rule 6 in my mind. Even minor deviations could trigger unexpected effects. I watched once as a small patch of water near the rig's edge darkened, then formed concentric ripples in response to my movements. I froze, recognizing the pattern as deliberate, and immediately alerted Harris. The response was quiet, but I felt a shift in the environment, a subtle rebalancing of tension around the platform. It was proof that even subtle changes in water behavior were consequential, that ignoring them was far riskier than overreacting. Observation itself was a safeguard. The rule reshaped every interaction with the ocean. I no longer walked casually along the deck or glanced absent-mindedly at the horizon. Every shift in light, reflection, or surface texture became a matter of concern, demanding attention and acknowledgement. I developed an acute sensitivity, noticing subtle discrepancies in movement or color that others overlooked. The water was a living measure of awareness, and Rule 6 demanded that I never let my vigilance lapse, no matter how trivial the anomaly appeared. Psychological strain built up slowly. Observing subtle changes constantly left me exhausted, yet hyper-aware, a paradox of vigilance that required both patience and precision. Each night, I cataloged patterns, noting anomalies, and comparing them with previous observations. Deviations that seemed inconsequential could escalate if unreported, and I began to see the ocean as a system with memory, capable of storing small infractions to be addressed later. The rule was less about the surface and more about cultivating a perpetual state of mental alertness. Even routine operations became exercises in attentiveness. Checking valves, moving equipment, or inspecting gauges required simultaneous monitoring of the water's subtle changes. I found myself calculating reflections, wave patterns, and color variations while performing tasks that should have been mundane. The rig became a complex map of vigilance, with the water as an active participant, responding to my actions and testing my compliance. Ignoring even the smallest shift could leave consequences unobserved, accumulating silently until they demanded attention in unpredictable ways. Over weeks, I internalized the significance of subtle water changes. It was no longer enough to react. Anticipation became key. I learned to predict where deviations might appear, how light and shadow could affect perception, and which areas required more scrutiny. Awareness became second nature, a constant calibration between observation and action. Failing to recognize a subtle shift was not just oversight, it was a breach of a silent agreement between myself and the rig, between vigilance and the unseen observer beneath the water. By the 5th week, the rule had transformed me. I could sense subtle differences in water texture and color instinctively, noticing anomalies before they fully formed. Every shift, shimmer, or ripple was assessed for intent, timing, and consequence. Rule 6 had become a framework for perception itself, training me to observe constantly, report immediately, and act with precision. The water was no longer just a background element. It was a participant in my survival, a silent judge of attention and awareness. Even now, I cannot look at water without scanning for anomalies. The lessons of that rotation are embedded in my instincts. Every change matters, every shift carries information, and acknowledgement is essential. Ignoring subtle differences is a risk that can escalate without warning, and compliance with Rule 6 is as much about training the mind as it is about safeguarding the rig. The ocean's patience is infinite, but its memory is unforgiving, and every subtle deviation is noticed, measured, and remembered. I first realized Rule 7. Always maintain a clear line of sight to at least 2 other crew members when moving across the rig at night during a foggy rotation, when visibility dropped to nearly nothing. I had been following routine checks on the outer deck, and the dense mist made it almost impossible to see more than a few meters ahead. I caught myself drifting away from the main group, thinking I could finish a quick inspection alone, and immediately felt a weight in the air, subtle but undeniable. It was then I understood that isolation wasn't the only danger. Even partial separation could be enough to attract attention, in ways I didn't yet comprehend. The rule was deceptively simple, but its enforcement was demanding. Moving without visibility of two other crew members felt like stepping into a different dimension, where the boundaries of safety were suddenly invisible. I tried to navigate by memory and the faint glow of deck lights, but the fog distorted everything. Shadows became ambiguous, reflections multiplied, and the water beneath the rig seemed to respond differently when I was alone or partially isolated. That night I learned the critical importance of maintaining line of sight as a protective measure, not just a procedural guideline. Even small deviations carried risk. A colleague lagging behind or advancing slightly too fast could create a gap in the network, which immediately triggered tension in my chest. The rig itself seemed to react, subtle vibrations running through steel legs, shadows forming near edges, and water ripples organizing in patterns that were impossible to attribute to the environment alone. I realized that Rule 7 wasn't just about staying with people. It was about remaining embedded within the collective awareness of the crew, a moving network of observation that kept the platform aligned with vigilance. I tested the rule experimentally, moving deliberately to observe consequences when line of sight was lost. Even brief lapses produced an uncanny sense of being watched from angles I couldn't identify, subtle disturbances in the air and water that seemed to acknowledge my presence with scrutiny. The rule required more than proximity. It demanded constant conscious awareness of who was visible and where they were positioned. I realized that adherence wasn't just about avoiding accidents. It was about creating a living map of human presence across the rig that the unseen observer could recognize as compliant. The psychological pressure was relentless. Even routine movements required mental mapping, predicting where crew members were, accounting for deviations, and adjusting my path accordingly. Once I noticed a colleague drifting slightly out of sight, and the water near the platform's edge seemed to shift unnaturally in response. I called out immediately, re-establishing visibility, and the tension in the environment relaxed. That was the first time I truly appreciated how literal the rule could be. Gaps in line of sight were not minor oversights. They were invitations to consequences. Fog, darkness, and structural shadows created constant challenges. I had to memorize patrol routes, anticipate where others would be, and move with precision to maintain line of sight. The rig, already a labyrinth of steel and machinery, became a dynamic puzzle where human presence itself was part of the structure. Deviating from this network even slightly made me hyper-aware of small sounds, subtle changes in shadows, and reflections that might indicate attention. Rule 7 demanded mental agility, spatial awareness, and unbroken vigilance to survive the night. One night, while moving toward a maintenance panel, I lost sight of one crew member briefly. The water reacted almost immediately, forming concentric patterns that didn't match the tide or wind. My heart raced, and I quickened my pace to re-establish visibility. The subtle but tangible tension in the air reinforced the lesson. Maintaining line of sight wasn't just about physical security. It was about signaling awareness to something that monitored actions silently, measuring attentiveness and adherence. I began coordinating movements deliberately with others, using peripheral vision, timing, and signals to ensure constant connection. Even when performing maintenance or moving equipment, I had to maintain at least 2 visible crew members at all times. Small errors or lapses could escalate quickly. Shadows stretched unnaturally, reflections multiplied, and the water seemed to hold a concentrated focus on any isolated individual. Maintaining line of sight became a rhythm, a silent dialogue between crew members and the environment, where lapses were noted, even without overt consequences. Sleep deprivation and constant awareness combined to make adherence mentally exhausting. Nights were long, and the pressure to maintain visual connectivity required near constant calculation. I would rehearse routes mentally before stepping onto the deck, predicting positions and adjusting my timing to prevent lapses. The rule had taught me that survival wasn't about mechanical skill alone. It required coordination, calculation, and trust, all constantly reinforced by the rigid adherence to visibility protocols. By my fourth week, I could instinctively maintain line of sight without conscious thought, scanning peripheries while performing routine tasks, keeping track of movements, and predicting deviations. The rig became a living map of attentiveness, where every crew member's position mattered as much as my own actions. Rule 7 was no longer just procedural. It had become a lens through which the night's dangers and subtleties were assessed, teaching me that vigilance depended on both personal attention and collective positioning. Even now, after rotations, I instinctively gauge line of sight whenever I navigate low-light environments. The lessons from that night remain vivid. The rig was alive, the water patient, and human presence connected, visible, synchronized, was both shield and measure. The subtle consequences of isolation, or partial separation, demonstrated why the rule existed, why adherence was non-negotiable, and why even a momentary lapse could trigger effects that might not be immediately observable, but were remembered and measured relentlessly. I first realized Rule 8. Never assume the instruments are always accurate during nighttime operations. Verify every reading manually during a routine check of the pressure gauges on the rig's central platform. The dials glowed faintly under the emergency lights, each needle trembling as if unsure of its own reading. I glanced at the digital monitors and saw perfectly normal values, but a subtle instinct told me something was off. When I manually checked the valves, the pressure was slightly higher than the instruments suggested, a difference barely noticeable, but enough to make my heart race. That was the first moment I understood that the rig could deceive you if you trusted it blindly. The discrepancy wasn't mechanical error alone, it felt deliberate. Every night I began noticing patterns where instruments would briefly display normal readings, even as minor environmental shifts suggested otherwise. A valve might appear closed, but resist movement. A gauge might flicker toward a standard value, even though pressure was clearly fluctuating. The water's influence, the rig's own hidden rhythms, or perhaps something beyond comprehension seemed to interfere with the technology. Rule 8 wasn't about mistrust for its own sake. It was about survival and awareness, forcing a double check of perception and reliance. Even minor deviations could escalate. One night, a temperature reading on a critical pipe appeared normal on the digital display, but manual verification revealed a dangerous spike. I froze, remembering past warnings that complacency could be lethal, and immediately corrected it. The difference was subtle enough that any routine crew member relying solely on instruments might have missed it. I realized the rig demanded attentiveness, requiring us to reconcile machine readings with physical evidence constantly. That balance between trust and verification became crucial to maintaining control over our environment. Routine tasks became exercises in careful observation and verification. Every gauge, dial, and monitor required a secondary check, whether by touch, sound, or visual comparison with environmental cues. A valve might hum differently than expected, a pipe could feel warmer than the display suggested, and the water's response beneath the platform legs seemed to correlate with these discrepancies. Nighttime operations were particularly vulnerable. Low light fatigue and environmental distortion created the perfect conditions for mistakes. If instruments were assumed infallible, I began training myself to sense anomalies before they became obvious. Subtle vibrations, faint hums, the tactile resistance of handles, and the behavior of the water itself became tools for verification. Rule 8 demanded attentiveness beyond reading dials. It required the integration of all senses, a continuous dialogue between perception and equipment. Failing to manually verify readings wasn't just a minor lapse, it was exposure, a vulnerability the water or the rig, or whatever watched, could exploit. There were nights when even my instincts felt insufficient. The rig would behave unpredictably, and instruments would seem trustworthy only to mislead. A pipe might appear stable but is faintly under pressure, a gauge might flicker subtly yet consistently, and digital displays would normalize discrepancies. The difference was always small and perceptible if not manually checked, but enough to unsettle me completely. Adhering to the rule became obsessive, a constant mental note to measure and verify, because mistakes, even small ones, had consequences that accumulated silently. I recall one night when the digital pressure monitor showed perfect readings across 3 main valves, yet the pipes hummed differently, and the water lapped at the rig's legs in an unusually tight rhythm. Manual checks confirmed dangerously high pressure in one of the lines. I reported it immediately, recalibrated the system, and waited for the response. The subtle tension in the rig's atmosphere seemed to ease only slightly after correction, a reminder that verification wasn't merely precaution, it was proof of attentiveness, a ritual ensuring compliance with unseen oversight. Even minor deviations in readings triggered anxiety. A misalignment of a needle, a subtle flicker, or a faint discrepancy in temperature could make the entire platform feel unstable. The rule taught me that survival required integrating instinct with empirical verification, never relying solely on instruments. The water itself seemed to react to inattentiveness, ripples forming and shifting subtly in response to lapses in observation. Over time, I internalized the importance of constant vigilance, checking and rechecking equipment to maintain control and minimize risk. Nighttime inspections demanded heightened awareness. Even routine maintenance required coordination with manual verification, ensuring that every reading was cross-checked against physical reality. A gauge alone could not be trusted, and reliance without verification felt like surrendering control. I began cataloging minor anomalies, noting patterns where instruments consistently deviated from reality. These patterns became a mental map of where attention was needed, a guide to prevent mistakes before they occurred. Rule 8 became both a mantra and a survival tool, shaping behavior beyond the rig itself. By my 3rd week, the discipline of verification had become instinctive. I rarely glanced at a monitor without confirming it manually, and every anomaly, no matter how minor, was documented and reported. Deviations were never assumed safe because the rig's behavior, combined with the unpredictable water, demanded respect. Instruments were tools, but human vigilance was the true safeguard. Compliance with Rule 8 was no longer optional, it was a condition of survival, ingrained into every movement, observation, and interaction with the rig. Even after rotations, I carry the habit with me. I check readings twice, feel surfaces, listen for subtle changes, and trust my senses alongside the instruments. Night operations taught me that relying on technology alone is dangerous when the environment is unpredictable, patient, and observant. The water beneath the rig, the shadows across its legs, and the instruments themselves form a complex ecosystem where vigilance, verification, and attentiveness dictate survival. Ignoring even subtle discrepancies can have consequences that are unseen but persistent. I first realized Rule 9. Never leave a lighted area for darkness without confirming that someone else is aware of your location. On a night when the overhead floodlights flickered and the rig's shadows stretched unnaturally, I needed to inspect a supply valve at the far end of the platform, but the lights were dim and the water beyond seemed to pull the shadows closer, as if testing my confidence. I almost stepped into the darkness without informing anyone, thinking the task would be quick, but a sudden chill ran down my spine, forcing me to radio Harris. That small action felt like it momentarily held the rig in balance, a fragile acknowledgement of presence in an environment that punished carelessness. The principle seemed simple, yet its implications were profound. Darkness on the rig was more than absence of light. It was a landscape where errors, misjudgments, and observation lapses were magnified. Every step into unlit areas carried unseen risks, and the rule wasn't merely about human presence, it was about signaling awareness to forces that measured compliance. Even when I knew the path and the environment intimately, failing to communicate my movement into darkness triggered subtle shifts in water movement, reflections, and shadow behavior that I could not ignore. That night, I moved slowly, maintaining constant communication, my voice steady but tense over the headset. Every shadow along the railing seemed elongated. Every ripple in the water seemed deliberate, as if responding to my presence. I realized that Rule 9 was as much about ritual as practicality. The act of confirming presence stabilized the environment, proving to whoever or whatever was observing that I had acknowledged the transition from light to dark. One lapse could make isolation and darkness far more dangerous than any mechanical hazard. The psychological strain was immediate. I found myself over-communicating small movements, noting every step and location of equipment, aware that darkness magnified vulnerability. Even when another crew member was near, I maintained contact because proximity alone wasn't sufficient. Verification required attention, awareness, and acknowledgement. The rig seemed to respond directly to my behavior. Waves shifted, shadows moved with an odd deliberateness, and faint reflections on steel surfaces seemed to anticipate my path. Darkness became an active participant in survival rather than a passive backdrop. I recall one inspection where a dimmed stairwell forced me to pause before descending. I hesitated, then called out to two colleagues still in a well-lit area. Their acknowledgement, faint but present over the headset, seemed to stabilize the immediate space. Moving into shadows after that felt less threatening, though my heart raced. I realized that Rule 9 was not just procedural but a psychological anchor, ensuring that movement into unlit areas was accompanied by an external affirmation, a tether that prevented isolation from escalating into danger. Even minor lapses had consequences. Once a colleague left a floodlit area without announcing it, and nearly disappeared into the shadows. The water's surface shifted in ways that were subtle but disconcerting, and I could feel the tension in the rig, as if the platform itself was reacting. The incident reinforced the importance of awareness and acknowledgement. The darkness didn't attack directly, but it measured absence, hesitation, and uncommunicated movement, responding to human carelessness with subtle but persistent pressure. Routine tasks changed completely under this rule. Even going to retrieve a dropped tool required conscious communication with someone in a lit area. The water shadows and faint reflections became part of an integrated observation system where every movement needed validation. Over time, I noticed the rig behaving differently when I moved unreported into darkness, even when my actions were innocuous. It was a constant reminder that Rule 9 wasn't about preventing accidents. It was about maintaining alignment with unseen attention that could notice absence immediately. The psychological pressure of compliance grew steadily. Darkness became a landscape of potential consequences, where every step required validation and coordination. I found myself calculating paths, identifying lines of sight, and maintaining constant mental maps of crew locations, even in situations that seemed trivial. Deviations from this rule produced immediate tension in the environment. Reflections shifted, shadows lengthened unnaturally, and the water's surface rippled in ways that felt deliberate. Compliance demanded discipline, focus, and unbroken communication. Even when tasks were mundane, the rule shaped behavior. I learned to scan ahead, calculate distances, and coordinate with others, ensuring acknowledgement before moving into dimly lit sections. Every stairwell, hallway, or platform extension required conscious verification, a mental exercise that became instinctive over weeks of rotations. Failing to announce movement produced subtle consequences. Objects appeared slightly displaced, reflections shifted, or the water's pattern subtly changed. The unseen observer measured absence meticulously, reinforcing the need for compliance. By the fourth week, the practice had become second nature. I would never move into darkness without verbal acknowledgement, mentally noting which colleagues were aware of my position, and recalibrating if any communication gap occurred. The rig's atmosphere seemed to settle when protocols were followed, yet tension remained, a quiet hum of awareness that reminded me of the fragility of unlit spaces. Rule 9 transformed the night into a coordinated ballet of communication, where movement, acknowledgement, and observation dictated survival. Even now, I cannot step into dim spaces without considering who knows my location. The rule embedded a habit of verification and vigilance that persists beyond the rig itself. Darkness isn't empty, it's measured, observed, and responsive. Every shadow, reflection, and ripple is part of an ecosystem that gauges awareness, and failure to confirm presence can leave one exposed in ways that are subtle, persistent, and sometimes irreversible. The lessons of Rule 9 are inseparable from memory, practice, and survival instinct. I first realized Rule 10: never trust reflections in water or glass at night. They may show things that aren't there during a midnight inspection of the rig's control room windows. The water outside was calm, almost unnaturally so, and I caught movement in its reflection that didn't match the waves. My heart jumped. I blinked, thinking it must be a trick of light or fatigue, but the reflection lingered, deliberate and impossible. I froze, instinctively recalling every prior rotation where shadows and water seemed aware of my presence, testing attentiveness. That night, I understood that the water and glass could become instruments of deception, altering perception to challenge even trained vigilance. At first, I questioned myself. The rig was a maze of steel and lights, and I had spent weeks monitoring subtle changes. Perhaps fatigue or low light created illusions. But then I noticed inconsistencies, movements in the reflection that weren't mirrored in reality, figures that vanished when I turned to confirm. I realized that reflections were unreliable, a distorted layer of perception that demanded skepticism. Rule 10 was more than caution. It was a mental training exercise, forcing me to distinguish between reality and the subtle manipulations of perception, a task that could save or endanger a life in seconds. Even minor reflections could trigger alarm. A ripple in the water near the rig's legs, combined with overhead light, could create the impression of movement where none existed. At first, I hesitated to approach certain areas, scanning repeatedly to reconcile the mirrored image with reality. Shadows of rig components appeared to shift against one another, making the space feel alive and deceptive. The rule taught me to pause, verify, and trust physical evidence over what my eyes reflected, to move deliberately and consciously when confronted with potential illusions. I recall one night when a reflection in a puddle on the deck showed another figure moving alongside me. I turned quickly, expecting to find a crew member, but the space was empty. My pulse raced as I remembered Rule 10. The reflection had been convincing, almost exact, mimicking my own movements with terrifying precision. I took a step back, reaffirming that verification was key. Relying on what appeared in glass or water alone was dangerous. Survival demanded skepticism and a constant cross-check with reality. The rig itself seemed to exacerbate the illusion. Steel beams, emergency lights, and the dark water below created reflections that twisted space and time. One moment a pipe appeared normal. In the reflection, it bent, swayed, or seemed to loom in ways it did not physically. I learned to scan twice, check angles, and confirm positions before acting. Even peripheral glimpses of reflected movement became suspect. The rule had instilled a discipline that extended beyond observation. It trained the mind to anticipate deception, whether from environmental trickery or unseen observation. Nighttime inspections became exercises in patience and deliberate verification. I would pause at every reflective surface, measuring angles, adjusting positions, and comparing multiple perspectives before trusting what I saw. A window showing the deck beyond, or water reflecting the rig's lights, could hide subtleties that might otherwise go unnoticed. The water, shadows, and reflections became an ecosystem of observation, challenging perception at every turn. Compliance with Rule 10 demanded constant awareness and vigilance, because illusions could be crafted to exploit even a single lapse in judgment. Psychological strain grew as the nights progressed. Even when no anomalies appeared, my mind anticipated false movements and deceptive reflections. The act of verifying reality became almost reflexive, scanning water, glass, and reflective surfaces before every step. A misplaced shadow, an unexpected shimmer, or a delayed ripple became potential threats. The rule taught me that the rig, the water, and the reflections were all instruments of perception testing, each requiring careful attention, skepticism, and deliberate action. One particularly foggy night amplified the rule's significance. Reflections on water became distorted and multiplied, producing ghostly doubles of crew members, equipment, and structural components. I moved cautiously, never trusting a single reflection, cross-referencing with peripheral vision and confirmed positions of colleagues. The water's surface seemed alive, responding to movement with deliberate shimmer and distortion, reinforcing that perception could be manipulated. Rule 10 demanded constant mental calibration, ensuring that instincts were guided by verification rather than immediate appearances. Even routine movements were affected. Walking across deck panels or adjusting equipment required scanning reflective surfaces first, mentally discounting anomalies and trusting tactile feedback. Every reflection had to be questioned, cross-checked, and verified. The rule didn't just protect against imagined threats, it protected against cognitive errors that could escalate into physical danger. I realized that the rig's night environment functioned as a persistent test of perception, forcing discipline and skepticism in every movement, a lesson internalized by repeated exposure and vigilance. By my fourth week, the skill had become automatic. I could glance at a window or water surface and instinctively distinguish distortion from reality, confirming positions, movements, and potential anomalies before acting. Rule 10 had become a cornerstone of night operations, shaping behavior, perception, and survival. I knew that even minor lapses could result in misjudgments with serious consequences. The water, reflections, and shadows formed a subtle network of cues, each testing awareness, patience, and the ability to verify before trusting appearances. Even now, I remain hyper-aware of reflective surfaces. Windows, puddles, and calm water trigger the same instinctive verification, scanning, and measurement learned on the rig. Perception cannot be trusted without corroboration, and the lessons of Rule 10 remain embedded in my instincts. Illusions are persistent, patient, and deliberate, and they demand respect, skepticism, and vigilance at every step. The night is never just dark, it is layered, deceptive, and alive with reflection, each surface a potential test. I first realized Rule 11. Never ignore the sensation that someone or something is moving just outside your vision. Even if nothing is there during a late-night inspection on the outer deck, the lights were dim, and the water beyond the platform seemed unusually calm, yet a subtle sense of presence made my skin crawl. I kept turning my head, expecting to see a crew member or a piece of equipment, but there was nothing. The sensation persisted, a gentle, deliberate tug at the edge of perception, impossible to dismiss. That night, I learned that the rig, the water, and whatever watched me relied on these sensations to test awareness, patience, and vigilance. At first, I tried rationalizing it. Fatigue, low light, and stress could easily conjure phantom movements, but the moments became too precise to be explained away. Every flicker of peripheral shadow, every shift in the water's reflection, seemed synchronized with my own actions. The sensation intensified if I ignored it, growing heavier in my chest, a constant reminder that absence of proof was not absence of threat. Rule 11 demanded that I respond to instinct, to sensation, as rigorously as I would to confirmed anomalies, training me to trust subtle perception without being paralyzed by it. Even minor deviations could unnerve me. A ripple against the rig's leg, a swaying pipe, or a subtle shift in shadows near the lights triggered immediate tension, forcing me to pause, scan, and verify. It was as though the environment itself was testing me, measuring my acknowledgement of unseen presence. I realized that ignoring these sensations wasn't harmless. It invited escalation, compounding the rig's quiet pressure. Night inspections became exercises in constant awareness, where instinct was as vital as sight, and hesitation was dangerous. One night, while checking gauges near the edge of the deck, I felt it again, movement just outside my vision, a subtle pressure in the air that pulled my attention toward the water. I froze, recalling Rule 11, and slowly shifted my gaze without turning fully. The movement seemed to retreat when observed, only to reappear moments later in another corner of my vision. I realized then that the rig and its environment demanded continuous engagement with these sensations, forcing me to acknowledge presence, even when no tangible proof existed. The psychological effect was relentless. I began to feel the rig differently, as if it were alive and aware, testing the edges of perception constantly. Shadows, reflections, and the subtle movements of water became indicators, subtle signals requiring attention. I could no longer dismiss fleeting sensations as tricks of light or fatigue. They had meaning, whether or not I could see the source. Rule 11 created a discipline of responsiveness, a constant mental calibration between perception, action, and verification. Even minor lapses were unnerving. Walking past a dim stairwell or an unlit corridor, the sensation of presence would intensify, and I had to consciously acknowledge it, shifting my attention to confirm nothing tangible had changed. The water seemed to pulse in response, the shadows seemed to stretch, and my heart raced with awareness. Each night, the rule demanded engagement with unseen observation, a vigilant mindset that extended beyond routine checks to instinctive responsiveness in all movements. Routine tasks became exercises in constant mental monitoring. Adjusting valves, checking gauges, and moving equipment required simultaneous attention to peripheral sensations. I noticed a rhythm in the unseen presence. It tested, measured, and withdrew, always just outside direct sight, creating a persistent state of alertness. Rule 11 had transformed perception itself, embedding a reflexive acknowledgement of these subtle cues, ensuring that no part of the rig, no shadow, no reflection, and no ripple went unnoticed. Psychological strain accumulated over weeks. Sleep became shallow and interrupted, my mind preoccupied with subtle, almost imperceptible movements. Even when the rig was quiet, I felt the same tension along the edges of vision, knowing that ignoring it was risky. The sensation of being watched or followed, though never confirmed, was as real as any physical hazard. Rule 11 demanded attention to these ephemeral cues, teaching that perception, instinct, and acknowledgement were as critical to survival as physical safety. The water's behavior intensified the effect. Waves would curl unexpectedly, shadows would stretch toward the deck, and reflections would shift just enough to suggest motion beyond sight. I learned to calibrate attention continuously, scanning deliberately while performing tasks, and adjusting position relative to light, crew members, and perceived presence. Ignoring the sensation even briefly could create moments of vulnerability, subtle but measurable. Awareness, recognition, and acknowledgement became the only reliable tools for navigating nights on the rig. By the fourth week, the discipline was ingrained. I responded instinctively to peripheral movement, subtle shifts in shadow, and the slightest pressure of presence. Rule 11 had become part of the rhythm of work, the cadence of observation, and the mental map of safety. I moved carefully, acknowledging everything outside my vision, yet never fully understanding what I might be seeing or what might be observing me. The rig, water, and shadows had trained me to trust instincts while verifying reality, a balance that felt fragile and essential. Even after rotations, the sensations persisted. Walking near any water, glass, or dimly lit area triggers the same instinctive alertness. Every peripheral movement, shadow, or ripple is scanned, assessed, and acknowledged. Rule 11 remains a mental framework. The absence of proof is not the absence of presence. Awareness, instinct, and acknowledgement govern every step, shaping perception, judgment, and survival. Nights are never fully empty, the edges of vision are never fully safe, and attention is never optional. I paused at the edge of the rig, one last night, staring into the water as it held patterns I could barely describe. Shadows shifted, reflections twisted, and I felt the familiar tug at the corners of perception. My instincts screamed to acknowledge, to stay alert, to respect the rule that had been drilled into every moment offshore. The rig seemed patient, waiting, and relentless, a constant reminder that the final lesson was not about equipment, procedures, or human error. It was about vigilance itself. If you enjoyed this story, Like, share, and subscribe for more.